Welcome back to PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 4.2 for Chapter 4. And this learning objective asks us to develop an understanding of how we form first impressions and how do we do this so fast and to what degree do these initial impressions persist. First impressions, generally speaking, are super important to the way people make sense of others around them. We appear to be, as a species, predetermined to make quick, usually fairly unconscious decisions about who people are right away. They are quick, but they tend to be long-lasting. And if you make a quick but negative first impression, it's very difficult to challenge that initial negative first impression because these first impressions can be pretty sticky. Initial impressions that are based strictly on facial appearance are done, when I said quick, I meant extraordinarily fast. We tend to be a facially oriented species. We have a lot of brain space that's dedicated to making sense of the face. Infants, as soon as they can focus their eyes, their best vision is just, about a foot away from your face. So if you hold a baby in your arms, their face is about a foot from yours. And that's where their vision is best. Why? Because they need to scan and make sense of your face and what it's telling them about their world. We know that very tiny infants, they scan the face, they look at the eyes, they look at the mouth, they look at other aspects of the face, and they make determinations. So, for example, little infants, they'll look at a face, and if that face is presenting pretty standard anger features, babies will often cry in response to that. If the face is making fear, is communicating fear, they may respond with concern and they may cry. If what they see is a big fat smile, they will tend to make gooey noises, and you can infer comfort and happiness from that. So we appear to be preloaded with the capacity to do this thing called thin slicing, which is pulling out meaningful information about other people based on very tiny samples of their behavior. Why would we need to evolve this capacity for super fast interpretations, even if they might be flawed? It's because, we live in social groups, and being a good predictor of other people's personalities, interests, skills, abilities, and, other things like their likelihood to hurt me are super important when you're living in that social environment. One challenge that we have, since we tend to make first impressions with very little effort, very little cognitive involvement, is that the first traits that we see tend to interpret a lot of our later interpretation, or tend to shape our later interpretations. And what this is called is the primacy effect. So the first judgments we make in our first impression tend to bias the way we perceive all other information about that individual. You would have to switch. So, this thin slicing, first impressions, it's automatic thinking, low effort thinking. In order to overcome the primacy effect, you would have to shift over to high effort, controlled thinking or controlled processing. What can happen if you don't is something called belief perseverance or belief perseverance, depending on your preferred pronunciation. And this is our tendency to stick with and justify our initial judgments, even if we're given new information. So, for example, you have kids, let's say they're, grade school kids, they come into their classroom on the first day, and their initial impression of their teacher is, their teacher comes in and seems to be upset, irritated. And that irritation in that quick impression may suggest to the kids, oh, mean teacher. Then that primacy effect of that initial impression of meanness becomes perseverant. It's sticky. And every new behavior, even if the teacher starts to show a lot of joy and interaction and pleasantness, it's hard to overcome that initial judgment that this is a mean person. So, for example, the kids could infer that she's just acting nice. When things get rough, she's going to blow. That kind of thing. Now, how can you reverse that? You have to shift away from automatic processing to high effort thinking, and meaningfully look for challenging information. Now, we'll get into that in a later part of the chapter when we talk about attributions and how to challenge them. But right now, we're going to talk about how do we manage the impression that we make on other people. Because now, we've been talking about how do you make these interpretations really fast. Well, let's flip it over and talk about how do you try to control what other people think of you. That's called impression management. Generally speaking, people are motivated to want to make positive impressions on people at their first meeting. Now, there are some people by personality who don't really care what other people think of them, but most people at least care a little. So they tend to want to present themselves in specific ways on first impression. There are times when you don't want people to see you as the nice guy. Maybe you want to come in and say, I'm in charge. You're going to answer to me. So you come in powerful. There was this little period of time where there was this thing going around the internet where you're supposed to use your power pose and stand in front of a mirror with your making a biceps muscle in the mirror so that you will see yourself as strong and powerful, and then walk into your meeting with that sense of power, so that you will have more control over the situation. Well, research has shown that power posing does nothing for you, in fact, but it's an example of how we are very conscious of the fact that we are seen and we are interpreted by other people. The tendency to control how the kind of impression that we're making on others, this impression management tendency, has both conscious and unconscious elements to it. In some cases, we are highly conscious and intentional about controlling how other people see us. There are situations, I've had lots of these, I'm sure you have too, where you're very upset about something and you need to have a confrontation with another person. And you go in deciding, I'm going to show control, I'm going to be clear, I'm going to be decisive, and I'm going to communicate all of that to this person I have a disagreement with. I'm not going to lose my temper. I'm not going to show a lot of cheerfulness. I'm going to be direct and controlled in my presentation to this other person. Another context, you may be like, I really like this person and I want them to really, really like me. So you want to come across as you think they want you to do so. So you want to, if you think this person will like you being very cheerful, very chatty, very talkative, maybe a little self-disclosing, you may want to present that. If you are trying to, quote unquote, and I don't recommend it, play hard to get, you're going to use a different set of impressions that you're trying to make by controlling your facial features, how you sit, how you use your hands, and so on, and how closely you sit to another person. If you want to intimidate somebody, you need to pull out all of the power facial features, a little bit of anger, a little bit of smugness, and a lot of physicality. And that can, communicate all those things. Now, a lot of that is super conscious. If you are overwhelmed with emotion, however, it can become automatic, what you're putting out there into the world. Research does indicate that we draw a lot of conclusions. In the United States, we tend to still use a handshake as a greeting. And we think we get a lot of information out of people's handshakes, like how strong it is, whether or not it's a sweaty handshake, whether their hands are cold or warm, whether they're soft and calloused or not. We feel like we can divine a whole boatload of meaningful information from just that microsecond handshake. And it's been found that those interpretations can actually have meaningful impacts, like decisions about hiring and so on. In addition to kind of trying to control how others see you, using body language can also have a backward effect. So the body language that you're presenting to others, so maybe it starts out as controlled, where you're wanting to present, let's say, warmth and openness. By behaving in a way that presents warmth and openness, we tend to then infer that we are feeling warm and open because we're also observing ourselves in our social situations. So the more you play act, so, maybe this is a person you don't like, but you need something from them. You need to, maybe you're assigned to a group project with them. You don't particularly like them, but you need them to play ball. So you may engage in a lot more positive behaviors, suggesting liking and openness to this person so that they will continue to be a good team member. The longer you do that, the more you will actually like the person. And this is an effect that we'll come back to again later in the chapter. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 4.2. In the next video, we'll be talking about how we determine why other people do what they do. And that is the whole world of attribution theory.